Welcome to Outcast, the podcast where we hear coming out stories from famous faces and brilliant LGBTQ+ people working hard behind the scenes, from all backgrounds and from all corners of the globe. On this podcast, we discover life stories, and in doing so, we dissect some of the most pressing issues faced by the LGBTQ+ community today. We hope we can support and inspire you, our listeners, whether you're part of the LGBTQ+ community, out or not, or an ally listening to learn more. I'm Rosie Pentreath, your host, and I've shared my coming out story in writing and on various panels, and I know firsthand the value of talking through my experiences. Now I'm giving people from all corners of life and from all backgrounds the same opportunity. You may have listened to other episodes before, and if you have, thank you for coming back. Or you may be here for the first time because of our guest. Welcome. You can follow us on social media at OutcastLGBT, and you can find us online at outcastpod.com. Thank you for listening. Today, I'm welcoming Chrissy Flanagan to Outcast. Chrissy is the Sydney-based founder of Chaotic Social, which dubs itself an after-school club for adults, designed to solve others' desire to make adult friends as well as my own, to use Chrissy's words. Chrissy came out as queer remarkably recently, in March this year, and she is a self-proclaimed baby queer. We explore that term and Chrissy's experience of so recently discovering her true sexuality, as well as her experience of being a neurodiverse person with a diagnosis later in life. Hi, Chrissy. Welcome to Outcast Podcast.
Thank you. Thrilled.
We met through a recent Chaotic Social baby queer panel. We'll come back to Chaotic Social, but I wanted to pick up on your experience as a baby queer and on the start of your coming out story that you mentioned in the panel. I think you said you realised you were queer during Sydney World Pride. What happened?
There's obviously been, you don't wake up one day at 40 and go like, do I potentially? Yeah, there's a lot of history to it, but it all just kind of came together, right at the start of World Pride. And all these people were saying to me, oh, this is amazing, just in time for World Pride, like so great for you to find out that you're a baby queer. I was like, I don't think there are orientation classes, so I don't truly know how I'm going to capitalize on this wonderful advantage and timing. But as it happened, then I did go to a bunch of stuff, and it was actually quite great. So I was wrong, and they were right. When you do have a later in life kind of it all coming together for whatever reason, a lot of mine was like 2 very long-term relationships that meant it just sort of wasn't on the cards. There's so much, if you're a thoughtful person, concern about how to find out about this ethically and in a responsible way and without being like a burden on the community. So that's sort of something I'm trying to experience deeply so that I can help other people in their journeys as well.
Yeah, and I like how you kind of tackled that in the class itself that I came to, the panel. You kind of have this sense of wanting to, obviously you want to dive into it and explore it, but you're very conscious of yourself and your history and what you sort of say or experience. And you kind of had some key questions in that class for a panel of queer people across the spectrum and across the kind of experiences of coming out at different stages in their life. I loved those questions. Do you have any of those burning questions that you still have or find yourself asking when you wake up each morning?
I've got such a live question at the moment, which is a very like a today evolving situation, and feels like a milestone on my queer journey, which is that there's someone that's in my life already where we've just last night acknowledged that we had feelings for each other, and that is AFAB, and she only dates women. We're in the deep conversations of, well, what do we do about that? Is that too high risk? But like once it's been acknowledged, what are your kind of options for going forward with that situation in either direction. But what's at stake, and but also what a lovely thing it could be if it did. Yeah, work out, but an incredibly sort of high risk situation in terms of the risk of our existing relationship, which is working for both of us already. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, the conclusion after very, very extensive texting over about 2 hours this morning, the conclusion is that we're just going to like meet up and have a pash. And that's so. But we've discussed everybody's every concern and all of everybody's potential hopes of what could be great about it as well. So yeah, there's always some new, when I feel like I've landed the basics, there's always like another little first.
Mm. I think what's so good about this and this situation is you're being so self-aware, and whilst you've come out later in life, to put it in a kind of a basic package, that kind of self-awareness might not necessarily be with you if you're coming out as a teenager or as a young adult, actually. So there's kind of pros and cons in that sense, that you're actually being more careful than perhaps making a mistake as a younger person.
I think, and definitely with the benefit of like a lot of therapy. I just had my 1 year therapy anniversary. Wished my therapist happy, 1 year. God bless. She took it very well. I didn't tell her I loved her, which I considered an accomplishment. I'm working, yes, in the baby queer space, but also in a lot of other behaviors that I need to
Mm,
on.
yeah.
Yeah, that definitely has been very beneficial.
Is there a way of describing how you first felt these things, how you first realised these things were properly real, that you could be attracted to women as well as men, or to people on the whole gender spectrum?
I think when I was about 13, I'd said to my mother, in the way you kind of do testing things out, I was like, "Oh, my friend thinks that she might be interested in girls instead of boys," and my mother's response was, "Well, you're not." Okay. And because I was desperate to impress my mother, that was just like the end of that being
Mm.
anything that it couldn't be in those circumstances. And then yeah, I was in a relationship all of my 20s. In my the year between I had between relationships, it kind of came back up again, but I looked into that in a fairly immature way, in that I had like a very, very bad threesome. Deeply regretful. No, nothing wrong with threesomes, but it was just like poorly planned on my part.
Mhm.
And that was not a good experience. And what I took away from that was like, oh well, then I checked, and as it turns out, I'm not attracted to women. I didn't put together like I'm not attracted to this woman.
Mhm. Yeah.
Way like if you have bad sex with anyone, you don't just go, oh well, then that entire gender. I just missed that.
Mm.
So that took me another 10 years, and then I got into another long-term relationship, and so then that kind of leads me to now. And it was I think it's like February when I've been broken up with my long-term partner since September, and then February I just sort of started feeling ready to date again. And it
Mm.
it just it didn't feel like a big thing. I was just sort of saying in a TikTok, I think I feel the interest to start dating people. And then at the end I was like, and maybe not just men this time. And people were like, did you just come out? I was like, oh, did I? I didn't.
Coming out on TikTok. It's very 2023, I have to say.
But like coming out without even like realizing that like I just hadn't quite I just sort of thought, oh, it's not really a big, like, it's not really a big deal. It's just, so it hadn't occurred to me to go that, yeah, that thinking that had standing, like, or significance. It was just something that I was feeling. But yeah, then it became like, oh, are you telling your parents? Are you telling your friends? I was like, oh, do people still announce that like that they're planning on dating whoever they're planning on dating. But I was like, oh look, fair enough. I do. I certainly am still very close with my mother and tell her everything. So it would be an omission if I didn't. Like if I'm going to be dating people, it's probably I will be telling her about that. So I may as well tell her in terms of a coming out. So told her, and she was totally fine. Largely, I'll have to relook my TikTok about that because I've largely forgotten how that went. I've subsequently had to come out to her a few more times after that because she's done the whole "oh, you and such seem like such good friends" thing. And I'm like, Mum, we're dating and we kiss, so I'm sorry that you haven't experienced intimate relationships where you also like there's a loveliness and a support to it, so you associate supportive behavior only with friendship.
I love that. I love you've like totally reframed that because I'm still in the camp of like, I can't believe they called us friends, just so homophobic, blah, 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 blah. So that's, yeah, amazing. And we do always keep coming out. That's another thing that I like that you just pointed out there.
Yeah, and it's that mix between, well, you want to like represent, and visibility is important, and particularly if you feel secure in your identity, and there are still people, and especially young people, who are not necessarily feeling so safe. It is important to have adults who do, and I feel exactly the same way about neurodiversity. If you're
Mm.
in where you're really happy to own the label, whatever the label is, if it's still divisive in some parts, then I think it's one of the most positive things you can do is to be really out
Mm.
about that, and proud, because there are people who don't know that it's okay to be proud.
Exactly, exactly. I want to talk about your neurodiversity a bit later. One of your questions there was, do people still have a big coming out moment? You talked about how you did decide to do that with your mum, for example. Have you found talking to lots of queer people and, being a baby queer, asking all these questions, have you found a lot of queer people you've spoken to have said, yes, that is what still happens and that is still necessary? Or are people a bit more relaxed? Or does it depend on your age?
I think it depends a lot on age. I've got a lot of friends who have kind of kids in their early to mid teens,
Mm.
and it seems like identity is just so dominant with that age group. But there's a sense of freedom, and that you can try on different things without it being kind of a huge deal. Such that, like, one of my friend's 13-year-old kids came home a couple of weeks ago and was like, "I'm a demisexual," and you're
Mhm.
like, "What?" And but yeah, there's not the baggage to it with the really young people. I find
Mhm.
that it's with people in their 20s, it can be so almost over politicized, like it's divisive for you to be anything too specific, so just everybody is queer.
Mhm.
And then but in getting into sort of the 30s and 40s, it falls starts to fall much more into the traditional, like, the groups can be quite sort of divided, and
Mm.
necessarily with like a broader sense of like, this is the queer community, but like these are the lesbians, such that people in different groups have previously like lobbied me to be part of, like, they're like, we think you're one of us. Like, I'm not totally, I appreciate and I'm very flattered, but I'm not sure it necessarily works that way. That like
Mm.
looking for recruits to your orientation.
It's like a religion. What I like in this is that, yeah, there's this kind of real nuance in those younger generations. Also, a nuance between whether you want to just say you're queer or gay as a catch-all, or if you really want to hone in on something really specific. So, yeah, being pansexual or instead of bisexual or bi plus, or all those different categorizations. And I think the way I land on it is that for some people, or even in some spaces and some vulnerable moods, you really do need that categorization. And then in other moods and in other spaces, you might be happier with the general phrase, and then you might not even come out in some places just because you're tired or threatened or something.
I do want us to get to a place, and I'm sure we will, I think in a few more generations, where it's not really that relevant. Like,
Mm.
it's not like society is present for sexual encounters. It's just like we have to go through a phase where it's a highlighted part of our identities in order to normalize it and have it made mainstream and accepted more broadly, because there still are places and people where it's not accepted. But it
Exactly.
just should not fucking matter to anyone.
Totally agree. I totally agree. And what's happening, so I feel like even in the sort of 12 years I've been out, when I was 18, it felt really tabooed and really difficult, which seems strange to say now. And I know there's other people that would have had different experiences. But within a couple of years, there was this watershed where people like Cara Delevingne was suddenly with a woman and people were coming out, etc., etc. So I'm kind of that generation. But now when I look at what's happened over the last 12 years, like how much more open and much more evolved things have become even in 10 to 12 years, it's amazing. But you're right, like we still need to do this coming out and this kind of work and talking about it, because we're still not quite at the stage where you can just be a human that rocks up with your human, and their gender and the sex they have and who they're attracted to has literally nothing to do with it the way it does in the straight community. But it is needed because, I run social media accounts for my career. And if there's anything to do with pride for that brand or business or TV show or whatever it is, inevitably a white man usually jumps on social media and goes, it doesn't matter who they're having sex with. The trouble is, they made it matter only a few decades ago. You got fired from your job, it was illegal, you were declared to have a mental health issue or illness. So what's happened is we've had to declare it as a good thing to reclaim it, and then yes, the next step in a decade or two, hopefully, if we don't go backwards, is that it will become irrelevant. I
Mm,
hope.
mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, just like another, like I enjoy tennis.
yeah,
On like a long list of things that are things that matter to you, but yeah.
yeah. And we keep saying baby queer. How do you define baby queer?
So I also got told off by the internet. That happens a lot. I'm fine to be police. When I had had my first kiss with a woman in like March, I had said on the internet that it was a very validating experience for me, because particularly being later in life, and also it's not that I was angry with men. I wasn't not angry. It wasn't like I didn't want it to be a rejection. Do you know?
Mm,
It's that kind of fear of gaslighting yourself that is like, have I intellectualized queerness? Because I have also done that. I wanted that, like, it was validating to me to have that backed up by a sexual experience that was absolutely on the par with any other in terms of the intensity of the experience for
mhm,
me.
mhm,
So that landed for me, but then quite a few people said you shouldn't have to you shouldn't have to have that experience. There are people can still be queer even if they're not sexually, like they can be, they're not, it's not the same thing. And you shouldn't be equating having sexual contact with queer people as you're not queer if you're not. So but for me, and for the age I was, that just landed with me. And I'd sort of, as a throwaway line, said, well, so maybe I'm not a baby queer anymore. And I was like very much told that I was in fact a baby queer, and to pull my head in. And because the panel said the other night that, it can be a bit of a problematic term, and it's a little bit of gatekeeping of queerness, and really is that something that we want to be supporting, which is a good kind of question. But I don't feel like I'm in a position to say what is appropriate as like a Johnny come lately.
mhm.
I don't feel like I should be say, no, you have to accept me as queer. If the queer people who've been here a long time are like, you're not a proper queer, I'm like, cool, I'm not gonna argue about that. So
I have fears of not getting it right, so I can understand where you're coming from. But I also do think, yeah, any gatekeeping like that on the internet probably comes from a place of fear and trying to protect yourself. So while I admire those people and I think these terms and safe spaces are so necessary, I feel like if you're queer, you're queer. I believe you. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but I know when I had to come out, because I had to be true to myself because it was really hurting not to, there was no question of whether I was queer or not, if that's what we wanted to call it, or lesbian or gay or, same-sex attracted. All of those terms applied to me right then. Yeah, it's a bit of a minefield on the internet as well, because I think people have a safe space in anonymity just to type something and say, but you're not properly this, you're not properly that.
Absolutely, and there were also queer people who were saying, and not very many at all, but it happens, saying, well, how is it possible that you at 40 are like discovering you're queer? Like I was co-opting it for clout,
Yeah.
which is incredibly hurtful, because you're like, why would I? I mean, fuck off. But it's
It is really hurtful. It's annoying to me as well, and I wonder if they're particularly young, because as someone who's been in the world for 5 minutes, you know that just life sometimes pulls you in a certain direction and it's still good. So if it's not too much of an encroachment, using your example of your first relationship, say it was with a man, with someone who's not same sex, you have a great time with them, you build a relationship and a life. It doesn't mean you're not still slightly aware of something in the background, but you just didn't go that way that time. And then it, like you said, again, that happened again. That doesn't mean you didn't have some kind of inkling, but also we are in a society that does demand us in most turns to deny the truth and deny the reality of what it is to be human quite often, even getting up for a 9 to 5 job or living in a certain city or doing things your parents say. We're never told to properly look in ourselves and answer the right questions. So why you'd suddenly be able to do that perfectly as a queer person earlier on and then discovering later in life, I don't know. I don't know why you'd suddenly be, oh yeah, no, I don't, yeah, I should have said it when I was 15. Sorry.
and also you can be bi, queer the whole time, and only happen to be in relationships with people of the opposite gender, like, and that
Yeah.
doesn't change that your queerness. I wasn't at a surface level aware of it. I've always been had a majority of queer friends.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been hit on by women, always, it's such that it was like a running joke in my family. Yeah, on a conscious level, I wasn't aware of it, but as soon as I started to unpack it at all and have the space to work through it, it all became extremely obvious. It was
Mm.
like a few things sort of happened to kind of tip it over to the front of my mind. Someone had said, a lot of people, women who come out later in life, think that everyone thinks that women are hot, and I was like, yeah, doesn't everyone think that women are hot? And I also realized, well, I thought that was what the male gaze was. I thought I was so straight that I was seeing women from like a male perspective, which is hilarious. And also I realized that with heteronormativity, that I wasn't attracted to men. I hadn't chosen men to be in partnerships with. Primarily, there's a lot of status, and there certainly was in my family, of being in a relationship with a successful, tall, this, that, this, like a person, like a man that is a credit to me,
Mm.
and as someone that has struggled for acceptance in my family and generally in my young life, being able to choose another person that would elevate my status and maybe increase my acceptance in society and family was not something I was going to give up. So
Mm.
I just saw them in a different way, but not a way that was connected to me being romantically or sexually attracted to them.
Mm. That's so interesting, and that makes a lot of sense. But and then on the flip side, your sense of not fitting in with your family does sound like a queer story, to put a very, very catch-all and generic sort of lens on it, but that is the queer experience.
Mm, absolutely. There's definitely overlap there with the neurodiversity as well, and I mean, and there's a huge amount, a lot of queer experiences and neurodiverse experiences as well. Huge correlation, the two sort of communities. But yeah, it comes down to, in both of those ways, my parents being from a generation where you had to cover things, like you couldn't be your authentic self.
Mm,
And it wasn't safe to be your authentic self. And our fundamental conflict was always just me wanting to be who I was
mm,
and being told that that was wrong and unacceptable. And that's really just a matter of masking and not masking, and masking applies equally to
mm,
orientation as it does to neurodiversity. Is it fundamentally just whether you feel like you can be yourself and whether you're supported in being yourself, or whether you've been told for so long that you can't be yourself that you can't remember who you are anymore, and it's really threatening to see someone want to be authentic because that's been denied to you.
absolutely. Let's talk about your neurodiversity and being diagnosed relatively later in life as well. How did that play out?
So I had realized probably about 3 years before I got the diagnosis, that I had autism. Like, self-diagnosis always comes before official diagnosis. Very, very rarely someone's psychologist picks it, but like the vast majority of people self-identify when you're coming to adults.
Hmm.
And I had been in a senior role in a government organization, and there'd been like a placement of people with autism in that workplace in specific roles, and that so the organization that did that placement gave a presentation to the whole organization that was like, this is what these people are going to be doing, and just so you understand, a bit more about working with autistic people, gave a
Mm,
presentation on that. But really, I think they knew what they were doing, and it was a stealth "Are you autistic?" presentation. Um,
yeah.
yeah, thank God it was during COVID, because I have no poker face at all. And yeah, like very early in the Zoom, I was like, camera is going off.
Hmm.
This is really, really hard. Because it was just like, oh, this is what like some of the characteristics of autistic people. And I was like, oh, fuck. That's a lot of to realize. And it was just incredibly clear. I was very, very sure. And at the end of the presentation, the people from that organization were like, and if this has, raised anything for you, talk to HR about how you can get support and blah, blah. And I thought, absolutely not, because this is a workplace with a toxic, ableist, elitist culture. And if I was to, like, not only will I not be talking to HR, I know I can't even go seek a diagnosis independently, because if I knew, like, for sure, I would be incapable of not saying so, because I just lack the
Hmm.
capacity to say things. So I was like, this is a piece of information that is unsafe for me to have. I'm just going to like push that down and not look at it for a while. And then once I left government and just started working full time in my own businesses, I was like, okay, like now we're going to go find out. But yeah, had heard a lot of horror stories about, particularly from women, being gaslit by psychiatrists who are just like, no, you've got a degree, and you've got a job and you've had long term relationships, so you can't. And like, who just couldn't even get looked at because of this dismissive attitude from some less educated practitioners.
Mm,
So talked to my doctor, and he was like, "Why do you think?" And I said, "Look, I looked up the criteria, the diagnosis criteria. I mapped it against my experiences that demonstrated that, and then I mapped that against how that's affected me in my life. Like, here's my 5 pages of Excel spreadsheets. If you want to have a look, these are some highlights." And it's like, yeah, I think it's probably something to look into. I'm really surprised, and I certainly have never thought that, but you've done the due diligence. So he asked around and found someone who specialized in diagnosing women. So yeah, went for that, and that was just a couple of sessions. But the psychiatrist had said, in order to diagnose autism, she needed to rule out PTSD because they can present in a very similar sort of way.
Mm.
Uh, but in the end, she diagnosed with autism and PTSD and anxiety and depression. I was like,
Oh, yeah.
thank you. And I mean, none of which is too surprising because when you've gone like this long with, yeah, not only kind of being forced to mask because you were not accepted,
Mm.
and then without the support, because without having the knowledge of what is going on with you, it doesn't keep you out of having labels. It just means that the labels you have are that you're weird and awkward and socially uncomfortable. So you do get yourself into situations where you are going to probably and very commonly sustain a few more, pick up a few more mental health issues.
Yeah.
The stuff that you were born with has gone untreated, and you've been actively, undermined in your life and being yourself.
Yeah. Even if it presents as you saying the wrong thing often, and then it creates difficulties in relationships, etc. You've mentioned masking a few times. It's easy to see the general definition of that, or what that could be, and you relate that to queerness as well. But what is masking when you're neurodiverse?
So it's trying to figure out what the rules are of what normal looks like, and then just acting that way. So,
Mm.
um, this is much more common in AFAB people because there's in socialization, especially early socialization, they're much more pushed to conform to what's expected, and there's a lot more like, oh, boys are just how they are, like, oh, you can't, you've just got to support them as they are. People female born are really dragged to, no, this is what's expected of you, and this is what's socially acceptable. So that's part of the reason that there's this what seems like a boom in diagnosis now, because there's a huge backlog. Anyone who's kind of over 35, I mean, really over 30, it just wasn't even something that was thought of.
Mm.
Yeah, of course, it seems like every man and their dog is being diagnosed now, but that's because that's a temporary thing, because we're catching this entire pipeline of people of a certain
Mm.
age who were missed before, weren't considered, it wasn't considered possible for them to have it. Particularly in
Mm.
the case of ADHD, it wasn't even a thing.
Yeah, that's so interesting because, not to minimize it for neurodiverse experiences, but women mask in society anyway because we don't have the power, and the patriarchy means that we have to behave in certain ways to stay safe in a social sense, and stay safe then in a societal sense, and then also in a very physical, real sense, not to be raped or murdered. So men tend then, am I right in thinking and understanding, to be diagnosed with ADHD and autism more easily because men in society don't mask more generally?
Yeah, because there's far less pressure put on them at all stages
Mm.
of their lives to mask.
Yeah, exactly. Outcast. Coming out stories from inspiring LGBTQ plus people today. What was your diagnosis specifically?
So in February of last year, it was autism, and then ADHD in September. All the clinicians always say, oh yes, so yes, you do have, autism or ADHD, but you're so high functioning. You're like, thanks, because the thing is as well, it's none of it necessarily, and it's different for everyone, of course, but it doesn't necessarily stop you being able to do things, but you're on like the boss level all the time. It's just much much harder
Mm.
do the things. But yeah, it didn't prevent me from getting 2 degrees and having 2 long-term relationships and, having senior jobs. But it made all of those things much, much more difficult. And some people can fall into grief, and I think this is probably an interesting parallel with coming out later in life as queer, but for what your life up to this point would have been like if you had had this information and had been able to live your life in this way, because yeah, I know my life would be unrecognizable if I had been diagnosed and had access just to the information and community, and that I was okay.
Mm.
And whereas I don't regret where I am now, I know I've gone through a lot of unnecessary hardships because of not having had this earlier.
God, that's such a compassionate thing to say. And I wanted to ask that. How has it changed your life to have that diagnosis, those diagnoses?
It's a matter of going, it's not what everyone's always said that I'm weird. I'm just not like broken in some strange way that's just unaccountable. I'm not like born wrong.
Mm.
And I'm in fact part of like a vast community of people with similar experiences, and how wonderful it is to know that now. At least I know that now. Lots of people before me have lived their whole lives, and never, had the benefit of this information. My mother's 80. My psychiatrist, when she diagnosed me, was also like, "P.S. Your mother also definitely has autism." She was like, "I don't need to see her. She does."
Yeah.
She's had to go this whole time, and has never, until very very recently, when I've been speaking more about the autism and the ADHD to her, um, has never ever communicated any solidarity with me in feeling different or not a part of things. And because she's been masking so hard and so successfully, that she was kind of stuck in this little box where she was lying to herself that she was even pretending anymore.
Mm.
So very recently she said to me, "Well, I've always known I was different." I was like, "You've never said that in 40 years. You've only said that I'm doing it wrong and that I need to be thin and popular and I need to fit in. You never said that you felt different. You aligned with them."
Mm.
I wish we'd had that understanding up until now.
Mm. Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
You've already sort of touched on them, and you can definitely hear the parallels between being queer and being neurodiverse. But have you got any examples where you've talked to people who are both things, and why those things often do seem to, and I think studies have shown, go hand in hand?
Yeah, so I was on this Vivid panel about neurodiversity the other night, and the entire panel was queer,
Mm.
and the other two panelists were both non-binary as
Mhm.
well. I don't remember the stats from that, but it's something like 50% of people with autism identify as queer and 20% as trans,
Wow.
which is hectic. And there's sort of more research required as to kind of what's up with that correlation. But speculatively, what the panel was saying was, there might be elements of people with autism find it very, very difficult to be in authentic, and they're much more willing to probe their feelings. There's a very high level of just naturally occurring introspection, and a desire to be exactly who you are. So it could be just that we're more willing to both accept and then communicate how we feel about our sexuality and gender, than the average neurotypical person. And so, potentially it means that there are more gender diverse and queer people in the neurotypical population, but that aren't prepared to look that in the eye, for themselves or for what they might need to do about that. But yeah, more research is sort of required. But definitely, it's a very, yeah, huge overlap between the two communities, and both of them are very, I find so far, safe and supportive for each other. And apparently, it's also not at all an uncommon story that you have like a revelation about your neurodiversity and your queerness in a similar sort of period of time. Apparently, this is like, I'm not at all an outlier
Mm.
in both happening. Yeah, and when I started telling friends that I felt, queer, like as a baby queer, there was no surprise registered. So, and there was a lot of, it's been really boring waiting for you to catch up. Once you start unpicking any of it, it just can fall apart really quickly in the best possible way.
Mm. Let's circle back. So, we started this whole conversation because I came to Chaotic Social, and I'm very grateful for that. And I love Chaotic Social. You've created this inclusive, colourful, very orange, welcoming, and kind of ingenious space for people in Sydney to make friends. Chaotic Social really resonated with me. I went along to the panel I talked about, but I also wanted to read a poignant paragraph on your About page. So you say, it's often said Sydney is a particularly tricky place to make friends as an adult. If you miss out on doing the big four locally or at all, so that's high school, university, work, and kids in Sydney, it's hard to bridge that gap, leaving many of us lonelier than we would like. I moved to Sydney when I was about 22, and I was like, oh my God, it's cold. I don't know what I'm doing. I feel so lonely. I'd grown up in Cornwall in the southwest of England in a small town, but I had lived in Bristol and I've lived in London. And I have to say, Sydney is exactly that. Like, that paragraph really resonates with me. It just is true. And a lot of people have said it. Yeah. So I'm very grateful that you have seen that, have articulated it so well, and created Chaotic Social. Tell us what it's all about.
I describe it as after school care for adults. I didn't go to high school or undergraduate university here. I moved here when I was, yeah, I think 22 as well, from Newcastle and then Bathurst. And yeah, you just never catch up. You never catch. I'm really conscious of it. And the friends I had in my 20s were all work friends. All work friends. I worked in politics in most of my 20s, and those were very all consuming jobs. And so, but those friends still work in politics and all consuming jobs. So they, in not working together now, I very rarely am able to see them because they're really, really fucking busy. And I work stupid hours as well, different ones to them. And then, yeah, and I don't have kids and I'm not going to have kids. So I understand this problem so well because it's my problem as well. And I'm just really, particularly after a breakup of a long term relationship with someone who had grown up in Sydney and went to university in Sydney, and I realized that I was in some ways quite dependent on his friends,
Mm.
all Sydney people. You really feel when that goes away how kind of thin on the ground you are socially, and also you look around and go, well, what am I going to do about this? There's just, and I don't sports. I suppose the fifth category is theoretically sports. I don't sports, and I don't think it would be compelling. I don't think I'd be an attractive friend candidate if I tried. If I am showing up, bringing the team down, I'm not good at trivia. Like, what are the options? Like, where do you go? So I just thought, fuck this. Like, I'm just gonna make my own thing. I'm just like, if I see if I see something that I think should exist, I'm not very capable of just leaving it alone. I just tend to, yep, make the thing happen. So I thought that I would have to kind of go sort of stealth with people. It's like, oh, it's fun craft, it's this, it's that. And it's like, oh, and P.S., you might make friends, because people can be really embarrassed about it. It's like the last taboo to say that you want to make friends, because we have exactly the same mechanisms, namely the internet, for meeting people to be friends with as we do for meeting people for dating. But people are much more comfortable with wanting to meet up with strangers for sex than saying they want to meet up with strangers for friendship. So I thought, okay, people have got like a weird chip on their shoulder about it. I'm going to have to just like slip it in. But people got it immediately, and they're showing up by themselves, and I've reassured them like that they're safe with me. that other people are coming by themselves as well, and then I'll take care of them, and the dog's there to like have a cuddle if they need just like a little quiet time cuddling the dog. That we're an inclusive space, and they're showing up, and I'm hearing people say to each other within 5 minutes of arriving in the building, hey, what's your Instagram? Should we get a coffee? The embarrassment just disappears around it. Doing anything by yourself in Sydney, people who are in that space with their friends seem to by default treat you like a leper who has never had a friend in your life. Like there's no sort of default respect for, oh, you're a confident, secure person who, doesn't like the someone to hold on to be okay to go about and live their lives. There's this like, shouldn't you be at home alone by yourself, you sad loser? Yeah, and which is incredibly dysfunctional and has driven a lot of people to be alone in their houses where they're not going to meet anyone and make any friends. It's this terrible cycle, and I just want to sort of like surface all of that and talk about it openly and try to just in a really practical way get people together, and it's working because I have people coming back to Chaotic Social with people that they've met at Chaotic Social, and they tell me about all the things they've done together. And I also have people messaging me going, loved coming, like, probably won't see you for a while because I'm so busy with the friends I made there. I'm like, good, like, run free, run, fly my babies. So yeah.
It's so good. Yeah. I think it took me moving to Sydney to be really ashamed to talk about how lonely I can be sometimes. And it's for that very reason. I've got friends who are Sydneysiders and they admit it, that the ones who have grown up here, gone to university to do their bachelor's, started their family and started making children. And they admit it. They say they're closed off and they're so proud of it. So then that makes my shame even deeper. And then I've heard Sydneysiders go, oh, but so and so hasn't got any mates. And what they're basing that on usually is an Instagram profile or something like that. Now, I think about this all the time. Like this topic is very raw for me, and probably I do need to take it to my therapist. But it is such a unique thing, I think, about Sydney. I think Sydneysiders are so judgmental, and I find myself having to, like, if I do things with friends, which actually, when I think about it, is pretty often, I find myself having to be like, oh yeah, I went for lunch with friends. I went for dinner with friends. I just kind of really, and I'm like, when did this happen? I didn't used to worry about it. Like my Instagram used to be about sharing pretty things that I'd seen or bits of architecture or street art. I'm like, oh no, should I have been just posting pictures to my friends those whole times? Like, should I have been, like, have I shown myself up to be the friendless person I am? Which is not true at all, but yeah, since moving to Sydney, it's made me very worried about it.
There's a real obsessiveness with it. I don't know if there's just some insecurity. Like I don't know where it comes from. I don't know what
Mm.
with Sydney, but I know, like with even with my dating profile, I showed a friend, and she,
Congrats.
yeah, she's like, "Oh, but where are all the photos with your friends?" I was like, "But it's not their dating like it's." So I have just lots of photos of me looking hot and doing stuff. Like, isn't that who like what you're looking to advertise? And she's like, oh no, you've got to.
Yeah.
And then when I look at people's profiles, it's just like I hate it because I'm like, which one are you? And sometimes like you'll see profiles where every photo is a group photo. And I'm like, well, I have no fucking clue. Like I'm not going to go through and cross reference. I would scroll and go, I do not know who you are. But yeah, it's this like if you don't have photos of you with people, then you must have no friends.
Mm, mm.
What it's mind blowing. It's like sort of upset. Yeah, I just if yeah, it's upsetting. I don't know why. I don't know where it started, and I don't know how we can arrest it. And there are just huge swathes of people who are openly and like proudly locked off. They're like, "Oh, yep."
Mm.
I'll be like, "Oh, did you meet such and such? They're great," and they'll be like, "I'm not open. Like, I've got my group of high school friends, and those are my friends, and will have no, they're just not recruiting.
Mm.
They're, and proud. I'm like, is that? I'm just missing where that's an awesome thing.
I know. And yeah, when I moved here, I'd never experienced it before. So I thought it was something wrong with me. As I've got older, I have learned that it just is the way it is with some people. And you just have to kind of ignore it and, yeah, then go to amazing things like Chaotic Social and just have a great time. I just wonder if, as a nation, in a very general sense, Australia has got a habit of being scared of the other and being scared of the outsider because of how it's been formed, white Australia with colonialism. So I wonder if it's just a weird a weird
Oh,
butterfly effect of that, because I think about it all the time. I'm like, I wonder why.
Sydney, especially, people not only like do go to university, who grew up in Sydney do go to university in Sydney, they also largely stay living at home,
Mm,
not even like in a different suburb necessarily from their high school friends. So I guess there's nothing to kind of, they just don't see any reason to break that link.
exactly.
Certainly in Newcastle, at least half of the people I went to high school with don't live in Newcastle anymore. But they haven't all come to Sydney. They've kind of scattered, and then those who've come to Sydney are all over Sydney. So I don't see anyone from high school because no one's like just down the road. But yeah, for people who, and maybe with the like insane Sydney house prices and things, it's all just feeding into keeping people trapped in the same ecosystem until they're like 25, almost 30 in some cases now. So yeah, I guess there's nothing breaking people off from that group. But I think it's, I mean, I think they're suffering because I think it's really healthy to, at pretty regular intervals in your life, be getting close to new people because you're changing all the time. And if you're not, then like maybe have a look at that as well. But if you're not growing and evolving all the time, and that's much easier to introduce yourself to new people as current you than to change like the baggage and the historical, all the stories and narrative that have been built up over decades, that you've been hanging out with the same people. Like, it's bad enough with
Mm,
family, and then when it's all your your close friends as well, I just think that's very limiting to your personal development.
100%. Like, I love meeting new people. Coming out stories from inspiring LGBTQ plus people today. You come across as overwhelmingly positive and, resilient, hopeful person. And I love asking my guests what makes them hopeful. So, what gives you hope?
And I'm definitely not like a consistently hopeful person. And I'm very upfront and vulnerable, in a very public way about my struggles. I'm often crying on the internet, trying to do it less, but like when I don't want to put like a pretty face on things, and I think it's important for people to see that other people struggle with things as well, because I think that's something that's largely done in private, and I think that's destructive. That we will only share the pretty successful, happy Instagram version of things. I think that's, yeah, doing us all damage. But at the moment, I am in a good place. And what makes me feel hopeful mostly is just that, like, the progress I've been able to see in myself, that I'm not just not letting people hurt me in a way I've just sort of consented to previously, and that I'm not letting people push me down and make me small and make me ashamed to be myself, and that I'm willing to make active choices about who I let in my life, and I will only let in people who are going to show me the same care, and respect and genuine authenticness and vulnerability and a willingness to say that they care about me and to be told that I care about them without that feeling like a big deal and me being really weird about. So I'm hopeful because I'm being more deliberate. I'm integrating what I'm learning, and I'm becoming even more so the person that I've always wanted to be and thought I couldn't, but now I know I can, and I just have to like get there.
Yeah, 100%. And I love the fact that you kind of spread this awareness online on TikTok and things. And of course, you're doing the amazing work with Chaotic Social so that hopefully other people can get to that place as well.
I hope so. I don't know what can bring our lives more value than being our authentic selves and communicating completely openly, because being accepted for someone that isn't real is actually incredibly invalidating, because then you can never get a genuine connection, and any validation that you get feels like lands hollowly, and it feels like, but if you knew the real me. So I think that's something that we should all aspire to, because I think it delivers equal value in all our lives. And I quietly think that would solve just a lot of problems in everyone's. I think everything would get much more straightforward if we were able to be ourselves and talk about it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks so much for sharing your story, and it's just amazing to kind of meet you again, and just hear about all your amazing experiences and insights. So thanks so much.
Thank you, and you too.
Thank you for listening to Outcast, a podcast with interviews and coming out stories from inspiring LGBTQ+ people. You can follow us on social media at OutcastLGBT, and you can find us online at outcastpod.com. Thank you for listening.